Welcome to this opening event of the Global Dive-In Festival 2024 here at Lloyd's of London. My name is Elonka Soros, as it says on the screen there. I'm your facilitator for this morning. Quick word about me. My background is broadcasting. I'm an ex-BBC journalist and programme maker, and I was also the Director General's Special Advisor on Diversity and Inclusion for the whole corporation. But now I'm a consultant working globally with companies to help them meet their diversity, equity and inclusion aspirations. I'm not going to talk any more about me, okay? But before I call John Neal to the front to make his opening remarks, there's something I need to address, okay? It's come to my mind via the team physically checking us into this meeting. And those of you who are joining us digitally, please bear with us for a moment. You see, there's been some disquiet in the entrance to this conference around the handing out of these conference buildings. And I hear there's been a little bit of conference biscuits, and I hear there's been a little bit of upset. So hands up, please, if you were given a pack of these nourishing nibbles. Hands up. Wow, look at that. You are highly favoured, aren't you? And I hear you got a particularly warm welcome as well, is that right? Oh no, well they didn't do their job properly. The rest of you, word is that your greeting might not have been quite so warm. And certainly no biscuits, okay? Look, the reason I need to address this is that I've heard that there's been a little bit of confusion, a bit of discomfort around the difference in treatment. And of course, by now you've figured we rigged it, okay? Those of you with the biscuits, you've not been singled out because of your shining talent or the energy or insight you're bringing to this gathering. No, you're just wearing something blue. And for that, you've been favoured and privileged, okay? Now, you can probably see where this is going. Being favoured and privileged in life as in the workplace is very often based upon factors that have about as much bearing on how you will add value in the job as wearing something blue. The body you were born into, the accent you speak with, even the suits you wear. And being part of a favoured and privileged group brings hundreds of everyday small acts of benefit. Those very warm handshakes, the friendly smiles, the genuine inquiry about the family or what you did at the weekend. Small acts of inclusion that kind of go over your head when they're part of your everyday. Now, they might seem insignificant, a bit like who got the conference biscuit. Doesn't really matter in the scheme of things, does it? But they boost confidence, they encourage participation, create a workplace environment that sets you up for success. Feels great. I bet it did feel great to be getting your conference biscuits, but it feels great to be in a place when you feel seen, valued, respected, welcome. You can walk into this room and feel like you belong. When we feel we belong, we feel confident to speak up and speak our mind because we know we're going to be listened to. And the more we're given the space to share our thoughts, the more we are likely to be perceived as high performers, get promoted. Before you know it, you're the CEO. And all because today you're wearing blue. Now, we're not here to talk about wearing blue or conference biscuits. We're here to talk about inclusive leadership, eliminating exclusions, removing barriers so that all talent can flourish. How it's going to work, we're going to hear some opening remarks from John Neal, your CEO. He will introduce our keynote speaker, Sir Trevor Phillips, and then we'll go into a panel discussion to include two inspirational women who have great perspectives to share on diversity, equity, inclusion and leadership. That's my opening remarks done. I hope you're not feeling quite so sore. If you didn't get one of these, I think you can collect one on the way out if you really wanted it, because I did hear that someone really, really wanted it, okay? So without any further ado, I don't think I need to introduce to many of you, but John Neal, CEO, Lloyd's of London, would you like to come and make your opening remarks? Thank you.
Morning, everyone. As you can see, no one told me it was blue, so I put grey on this morning. So there is no privilege here. So welcome to the opening event of the Dive-In Festival 2024. we kick off this morning by celebrating an incredible milestone. It's the 10th anniversary of Dive-In. So if you cast your mind back 10 years, Gen Z were still at school. I was actually living in Australia, which is slightly scary. Some things don't change because Taylor Swift was #1 in the global charts. She still is. But it's amazing that we've come all this way in 10 years. We've seen incredible growth, not just in our industry, but in this festival, because on the first event, it started in a room not dissimilar from this, but with just about 100 people. So this year's bigger than ever before. In fact, Dive-In will take place in a record-breaking 46 countries, and there's over 130 different hybrid events. So added to the lineup this year, we welcome Greece, Mauritius, Namibia, and the Philippines, each with their own exciting programs and their own perspectives. So hopefully, without sounding like I'm presenting the Eurovision Song Contest, let me say from London that we're very happy to be sharing the Dive-In global stage with each of them. So this year's theme is a sustainable future the next 10 years, and we'll focus on the critical role that an inclusive culture plays in driving performance, innovation, and resilience, and each of those in the long term. So with a theme so broad and so bold, it's fitting that our programme covers a really wide array of topics, much more than ever before. So it includes social mobility, neurodiversity, multi-generational workforces, gender equality, the impact of AI, sustainability, and mental health resilience in the workplace. And the list just goes, honestly, on and on. So there's something, I think, to cater for all curiosities and indeed all career paths. So I'd like to thank the CEOs that took part in the video campaign, advertising the agenda, sending a clear message from the top on practical forward-thinking strategies. That's not only the right thing for us to do to be here, but it's also super good for business. Over time, all great ideas grow and evolve, and I think that's been 100% true of Dive-In. Dive-In is now certainly not a 3-day festival engaging talent across the industry. It features throughout the calendar of the year and has a much, much wider set of initiatives. So take Dive-In to reverse mentoring, which connects junior talent across the globe with senior leaders to foster new ideas and to embrace change and challenge. Or dive into insurance, which creates new avenues for our markets to engage with outreach, promoting education and employment, with the aim of attracting the very brightest minds to come into our industry. So encouragingly, we've seen the take-up of these initiatives in 24 countries, and undoubtedly there'll be many more to follow. So I'd also like to add my thanks to the thousands of volunteers for their hard work in putting together the agenda for the year, not just these few days, and also across many borders and in many languages, the ability to celebrate 10 years in the biggest way possible. I'm proud to say that Dive-In is a result of a sector-wide collaboration that actually really does define our industry. So thank you to the 32 global festival partners and organisations around the world for their support, the venues that they put at our disposal, and the volunteers. And thanks to all of you for making time in your calendar today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who's the award-winning broadcaster, writer, and former politician, Sir Trevor Phillips, to the stage. He's an internationally respected expert and commentator on diversity, leadership and inclusion in both the corporate and the governance spheres. So I'm excited to be sharing the stage with him. I'm also excited to be sharing the stage with Zelda and with Laura. Being an amateur cyclist, it doesn't get better to be on stage with Laura, so thank you. So thank you to everybody. Please enjoy the festival and really engage with everything that's on offer. It's a great opportunity to learn, to network, and to find inspiration. So with that, over to you, Sir Trevor.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, John. When I arrived here this morning, I was asked if I wanted to be addressed as Sir Trevor, and I just do want to make it clear right at the very beginning that in my household, my wife says titles are never to be used unless accompanied by a horse and a damsel in distress. And for those of you online, is not here. I also feel rather humbled to be on stage with Zelda and Laura. It slightly takes me back to a very early encounter I had when I was in started in journalism, and I won my first international award. I'd been to the United States to have the award presented, and I'd met Denzel Washington. Ooh, and I'd come back feeling immensely pleased with myself. I went to a conference, and I was sitting chatting to a chap, and he said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I told him I was a journalist. I just dropped that I'd just got this award. And he said, "Oh, that's fantastic, so amazing and wonderful." And I said, "So what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm trying to break into movies. You know, I directed a thing, but I'm now doing script writing. But I really want to be a director, but I'm doing script writing." I said, "Oh yeah, done anything interesting lately?" He said, "Yeah, I wrote the script for a little film." I said, "What's it called?" He said, "The Empire Strikes Back." I've learnt to understand my place in the hierarchy, and I fully understand that this morning I'm merely the warm-up act for Zelda and Laura, who are the stars here. I'm honoured to be on the same stage as them. I'm honoured to speak to you partly because even though I do a lot of this kind of talking, I always regard it as a strange privilege for someone from my background. I should say that my family came here from what was then British Guyana in 1950. My parents already had a lot of children. Then they had me. I'm the 10th of 10 children. Anybody in the room from immigrant background will know what then happens. 10 into 2 small rooms in North London doesn't quite fit, so they send you back home. So I grew up for most of my childhood in the Caribbean, but I belong to a family that's spread out across the world now, across the United States, Canada, Europe, a couple in Africa, and now I have a nephew in Singapore. So I'm fascinated to hear the conversation that's going to go on today, because when we talk about diversity and inclusion, often I think we tend to think of it purely within our own national boundaries. And I'll say a little bit about what I think is happening here in the United Kingdom a little later. But of course, the issues that we're trying to address are, if not universal, they are certainly transnational. One of the things that I do is I chair a recruitment company called Green Park. We operate at the executive level. We put about 500 people or thereabouts in what I call boss class jobs. I board -1, board -2 every year. We have done pretty well as a company for a number of reasons, but I would say principally amongst them is that 4 or 5 years ago, we decided that we wanted to show a particular thing. And a particular thing was that we wanted to answer the thing that board chairs and CEOs constantly said to us. We want to be more diverse, but we can't find the right people. Of course, I don't need to lecture anybody in this room. Of course, this is nonsense. It may be hard using the conventional historical methods of finding people and understanding or using the conventional historical understanding of what good looks like to find somebody who is not a white public school or private school educated man to fill a job that's going to pay somebody $250,000 or more. But actually, if you think about merit as it should be thought of, not what person looks like me, because I'm the most meritorious person in the world, of course. If you think about merit objectively, it is much easier. And we have, we're not the only ones who've done this, but we've been very fortunate that in our work we've been able to get to a place where something more than half of the people we put in boss class jobs are female. About more than a third are people from ethnic minorities. And I make this point not to boast, but simply to say we're not that smart. And if we can do it, all sorts of people can do it. So the question we want to ask ourselves is, why don't they? And I want to come to that in a second. The third reason I want to be, I'm grateful to be here is that my friend and I suppose associate, Mark Lomas, who runs things here at Lloyd's, has been working with us very closely on an exercise to bring insurance leaders together to address some of these issues of inclusion. And what I particularly appreciated about Mark's initiative is that it understands that we are not going to solve these problems just by ourselves, one company, one organization at a time. The value of this kind of gathering is that we begin to share experiences. We begin to understand that we are not alone in this journey. So that is why the conversation, I think, that is going to take place here is so important. Of course, we can congratulate ourselves. There has been great progress, I think, over the last 10 to 12 years. The work of the Hampton-Alexander review, which has, along with the 30% Club, actually done an enormous amount to lift women's participation in corporate leadership. The Parker review, the analogue to do with ethnicity, has also made a difference. When we launched Parker, I was had been asked to, by the then Secretary of State, Vince Cable, this is going back a long time, 9 years, to do something. He knew, Vince had called me to his office, and he knew that there was going to be an election, and I think he probably reckoned he wasn't going to be there for very much longer. He was completely right. And he said, we've got to get something done about diversity on boards. And I said, oh, Vince, what do you want to do? And he said, I've done my bit, I've called you in, and now I've told you you've got to do something. One of the things that we did do was to bring John Parker, who those of you who work in the corporate world will know is an A grade, or is an A grade FTSE 100 chair. When there's new jobs going, people first ring up Parker and see if he's available. Because the thing about this was that leaders worry about what other leaders think. And I could ring them up, people take my call, but I'm not a FTSE 100 CEO, I'm not a FTSE chair. Why would they take me seriously? Answer, no reason, but they would take John Parker seriously. I can tell you, when he set the goal of one person at least from an ethnic minority on board, nobody thought we'd get there, but actually we did get there. And part of the reason we got there was that he would ring people up and say, if you don't get it done, I'm going to be explaining to people that you didn't get things done. I can tell you, the last people to come on board were the mining companies, and I know why they came on board, because they had that phone call from Parker. I tell you that because, as I'll go on to say, there are objective forces which aren't about individuals, but I do think that the individual actions of leaders can make a difference. I have seen it. I have seen it. And that is why, again, awareness of the kind that we're building in these kinds of meetings makes such a difference. John, quite rightly, John Neal spoke about the theme of sustainability. Again, this is at a critical moment. As I said, we've made great progress. There's been great compliance. The Hampton-Alexander targets, Parker targets, everybody's got a program. People are rather conscious of it. It's in many places on the board agenda. But there's a difference between saying you want to do something and doing something. What the sociologists now call the say-do gap. And I think there is a great deal of saying, not always a great deal of doing. Second point, a lot of progress is made, as I've said, by the actions of individual leaders. But what happens when the individual leader leaves and goes to a different job in a different place? We saw this in, Elonka mentioned that she worked in broadcasting in the BBC, and you will remember a friend of mine that I worked with as a young researcher and producer, Greg Dyke, became the Director General of the BBC. And he was committed. He'd spent a lot of time thinking about the issues of diversity and so on, and he became famous for complaining that the BBC was hideously white. Now, there's a not, the chap at the top of a 27,000 person organization can do a lot, but he or she can't do everything. But in Greg's case, he told a story about the BBC to itself and to the rest of the world, which did galvanize people. Things changed. I can also tell you, the moment he left, things changed again. And they changed to where, pretty much, where it was before he got there. So this challenge of sustainability is a real one. Things should not depend on the leader of today being there forever, because the truth of the matter is the leader of today won't be there forever. So the question is, how do we embed some of the changes that we want to make in the way that we get organized? And of course, there are new challenges. Globalization means not just information and capital moving around the world, but also people. The United Nations tells us that right now there are more people working and living and working outside of the country of their birth than there ever have been before in human history. Somewhere around 300 million, they expect, they think. Now, that's a dry figure. But the truth of the matter is that in the real world that all of us work in, it means that our offices, our factories, our logistics departments, the depots that we get the buses out of, have kinds of people that aren't familiar always to us. That's a big thing. In every workplace, the mix is changing. And secondly, there's going to be more of it. In this country, in the United Kingdom, population growth between now and the end of the century will come not from what's called natural increase, children we have, it will come from immigration. By the middle of this century, something like 35% of our population will be people of color. Think about that. Think about the contrast from the days when I started work in 1980, when that figure would have been about 4%. 1 in 25 to 1 in 3 in one working life. Now, of course, we don't want to tie behavior to race and so on, but the truth of the matter is, these people will bring different inheritances. They will bring different skills, but they will bring different expectations and different ways of doing things. And most of our workplaces are not ready for this, any more than they are ready for the fact that, again, when I started work in 1980, something like 2/3 of women, a little bit before this, in the 1970s, 2/3 of women were not fully in the labour market. Today, 7 out of 10 women are in the labour market. And our workforces reflect that. Thirdly, there's a change in sentiment. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. After 2020, Black Lives Matter, after Me Too, you couldn't move in boardrooms and leaders organizations for people worrying. And they were worrying about risk. And they were right to do so. I think it is probably fair to say that the high watermark of that anxiety has passed. And there is more resistance now to dealing with the changes that I've just been talking about. But said against that, there are also increasing frictions over how we speak about each other on the basis of gender, or faith or race, frictions about how we manage groups of people, frictions about what requirements are afforded to workers and to our colleagues. And there will be objective imperatives for people to be thinking about diversity. One is, of course, the change in the mix that I've just mentioned, more women at work, more people from ethnic minorities. But there's a second point about that fact that I think is a tricky one. I'm going to introduce this morning, and I'm sure that there are people who might contest this, but I think we need to discuss it. One of the things that I discovered quite early on in life is that people from ethnic minorities didn't get very far just on the basis of the judgments that were made about other people. I grew up, and again, anybody from an immigrant background will be immensely familiar with this, with parents saying to me, in order to get half as far, you've got to be twice as good as everybody else. I think that is probably true, was true for women, still true to some extent, I suspect, but it was truer in the past. But what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that the people who did break through, frankly, were just better, because you had to be superior. And we see, I don't think those of you who read the Financial Times will have seen quite a big piece a couple of days ago showing that there are more female graduates out of this country than male now, that women are actually better qualified. That doesn't mean that they're going to get better jobs, by the way, for reasons that we all understand. But we are in a place where there is a problem facing leadership, which is that if we stick to the traditional ways, then actually what we're doing is wasting talent that has come available to us. I made the point a moment ago about immigration in this country, 1.2 new migrants every year. I can just make a similar point. People who leave poor countries and go 4,000 or 5,000 miles into the unknown tend to have two qualities. One is they're the ones who get up and go from the village. They're the ones who do not want to put up with what their parents did. They are the ones with drive and ambition. The people who get there also tend to be the ones with capability, the smarts, and so on. It is not an accident that 6 of the top 12 companies in the United States are now run by Indian Americans. There will be an issue here about the place of people, new people in this mix in our new world that all organizations are going to have to deal with. So what do we, sorry, I've lost a piece of my note, but what do we now, sorry, okay, thank you. What do we now have to do? At the heart of what I want to suggest to you this morning is that all of us who work in diversity and inclusion, who are advocates for it, need to change our thinking. We've been dominated, I think, for quite a long time by what I consider Sunday morning thinking. You may not be religious, but those of you who grow up in church will know that Sunday morning is time for somebody to tell you how to be a better person. And there's nothing wrong with that. I spent most of my childhood being told to be a better person, failing, of course, but I know what that's about, the moral case, and there's nothing wrong with the moral case. The problem is it's not by itself sustainable. What also matters is what happens on Monday morning. You're in the office and the boss says, I don't like these quarterly figures. Let's do something about it. And that suddenly takes precedence. Now, if your diversity and inclusion agenda is not part of what happens on Monday morning, then it is not sustainable. I think we all need to think about how we make the case that diversity and inclusion matters as much on Monday morning as it does on Sunday morning. And that means a focus on business benefits. And the first point, I think, is that diversity by itself, which has been a goal, representation, so on, is not enough. I always compare this to somebody who's having a birthday party. You can have a great birthday party with men, women, gay, straight, black, white, and there's diversity all round your birthday party. Job done. Well, not quite. If you then put the decks in the hands of somebody who thinks that the only music you can dance to is Metallica, then those people aren't coming back. They're not coming back. That's the difference between diversity and inclusion. You can have who you like in the room, but in order to keep them in the room, then you have to change your culture, the way you do things, to make sure that they are all part of it. Diversity by itself is not enough. So what are the levers that allow us to do this? Let me pick out three that I would like everybody to think about. First of all, do we know what works and what does not work when it comes to inclusion? There are many things that go in and out of fashion in diversity and inclusion world, and some work and some don't work, and some work some of the time and some work none of the time. I would say, for example, that the sponsorship has proven itself. We know that there are data, particularly from the United States, which shows that if you have a proper sponsorship program, particularly for women, then women's advancement actually goes much faster. And when I say sponsorship, I do not mean mentoring. The difference between mentoring and sponsorship is, for me, is this. Sponsorship is what's traditionally happened. You know, people get advancement because they belong to a team, they belong to someone's gang, people have faith in them. Mentoring is what happens when somebody talks to you. In short, mentoring is what happens when you are in the room. Sponsorship is what happens when you're not in the room. That there is somebody who is there to speak up for you because they know you. And when the question comes, oh, who should we send to this conference as part of their development? There is somebody in the room who says, let's not just send the usual suspect. So sponsorship, number one. The question of what works and what does not work. I'm not a big critic, for example, of unconscious bias training. I know there's a lot of controversy about it. But what I do think is true is that we've learned that it has a very specific and limited use, and that we need to understand what that use is and apply it and move on. The second thing I think we need to be talking more about are what are the new insights and novel solutions to problems. I'll give you an example of something that we've discovered at Green Park, because this is, I think there's a tendency sometimes to imagine that if we say the same thing enough times and loudly enough, everybody will be convinced and will solve the problems. No, we learn new things. One of the phenomena we observed at Green Park 2 years ago was that we would place black male executives in jobs and they would prosper for a while, and then at a certain level they would leave. And we identified this level at the place in which you'll be familiar with in most organizations, where everybody's got the same qualifications, everybody's done the same thing, but you get advancement because there's confidence in you. What we discovered when we did a little bit of research on this is this hypothesis, or what we came up with, this hypothesis. In most organizations, at that level, you get advanced because of what people think of you. And they have three sources of knowledge. One, they've worked with you. They've seen you day to day, and they know how you operate. Secondly, they know somebody who knows you that well, and they get firsthand. Third, they've heard about you. And this third thing is the trickiest part, because quite often what they hear about you is not you, but your type. Women have understood this, I think, for the last however long, that actually somebody who knows you has a view about you, somebody who knows you well has a view about you, and then there's lots of other people who've got a view about you because you're a woman. And what we worked out was that particularly in large organizations, what was happening to these black men was that they were being judged not as the person they are, but the type that they are. Because what we would see is that they would leave larger organizations, go to smaller organizations and prosper. They'd make a lot of money. Question, what do you do about that? Because this is not evil, this is just the way that organizations work. Well, we were asked to address a particular big company, transnational, it's got initials, you all know it, not going to tell you. And they had a big office in Chicago, where the legend was that, I'm telescoping a lot of circumlocution here, that black guys were trouble. Well, we couldn't change the view of the whole organization, because this is built up over many, many years. What we did, and this is where I mean by novel solutions, was ask them to embark on a program of sending their promising, hypo, black executives to different postings, usually abroad. It's interesting, within a couple of years, things began to change, not hugely, but perceptibly. Why? Because these guys were no longer the black guys who caused trouble, but they were the guys who solved the problem in Shanghai, the guys who opened something new in Johannesburg. So we need to look out for the new problems and the novel solutions. The last thing I want to address is nobody these days can do a keynote speech without saying the letters AI. I'm not going to bang on about it because I actually own an AI firm and nothing irritates me more than people talking nonsense about AI. But what I do know is that automation, fourth industrial revolution, is going to bring huge changes to the way that we work. But those changes will not be symmetrical. They will not be the same. I was president of the John Lewis Partnership for a while, got to know a bit about retail. And one of the things that we knew straight away when all of this started to come down the road was that sooner or later we would be in a cashier-less business. Now, great, terrific for the consumer. Broadly speaking, you know, you go through faster and so on. But the impact of that change is not symmetrical, because who's on the cash desk? Almost exclusively women. Sooner or later, coming down the road, literally, with the driverless cars, it won't be driverless passenger cars, it'll be long distance lorries and so on and so forth. There will be a lane, and there might be somebody in the cab, but there'll be fewer of them. And who will that affect? In the United States, 3 or 4 million largely male drivers. The point I want to make here is we are coming into a world where things are going to change. They're not going to change in the same way for everyone. And we aren't even beginning to think about it. But this is why diversity and inclusion has to be part of the sustainability picture for every business. Because it's no longer a set of questions that are about being nice to women or not being offensive to people of colour or lesbian or gay people. It is, how does your business prosper in a new world where many of the things we have to deal with are in uncharted waters? Every business is thinking about this, and in their risk register, in their conversations, in their thinking, has to be, how is this change going to affect different kinds of people? Because if we don't understand that, we don't really understand how we're going to go forward. As one American friend said to me some years ago, if you don't have a strategy for diversity and inclusion, you don't have a strategy for business. And that's what we've got to convince everybody of right now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Sir Trevor Phillips, or Trevor, for that thought-provoking introduction to our discussions today. And already questions are coming in from our audiences here in the room and those joining this session from Lloyd's offices across the globe. I do need to ask the technician to fix the iPad. It's logged me out. I just thought you can log me back in. Okay, thank you. Right, well, before we hear more of your insights, I'd like to introduce the rest of our panel. How I'm going to do this is introduce our two guests, the two extra guests, individually, and then they will have a few moments to just share their story, give us a bit of context. I think we've had the two chaps up here, so I think it's only right that the two women get a chance to say their piece as well. So, first of all, please welcome to the stage. This makes it sound like I'm doing one of these boxing introductions here. It's the most successful British female athlete in Olympic history, 5 times Olympic gold medalist, 7 times world champion, and 14 times European champion cyclist, Dame Laura Kenny. Thank you. And I will ask Zelda, joining us all the way from South Africa. Thank you for taking the time to be with us in person. Former private secretary to Nelson Mandela, author of the best-selling book, Good Morning, Mr. Mandela, founder of the Zelda Grange Foundation, Zelda Grange. Okay. Okay, so I think I'm going to ask Laura for you to come to the lectern. I think, obviously justly we can use the term high achiever to describe Laura. And since her Olympic successes, she's been a champion and advocate for women in senior leadership. Laura.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome. Thank you for having me. The team here, said to me, you've got 3 minutes to introduce yourself and tell your story. And I thought, I only really need 3 seconds to say, all I do is I ride around in circles for fun. So I guess I'll start by going through my journey very fast. I was a 20-year-old bike rider when I got the opportunity of a lifetime to step out in front of a home crowd at London 2012. Now, 20 seemed mental in my head. I wasn't ready. How could I possibly be ready to step out in front of a nation, thousands of people watching, and try and win gold medals? It turns out that was the easy one. So London 2012 was an absolute breeze. And I went on to Rio and did the same thing at 24. And then along came Tokyo, which was obviously 5 years later. Now, Tokyo was very different for me because I decided I was going to pause my story partway through and have a little boy. So I came back to Tokyo 2020, which was actually 2021, as a mother as well. And I like to think that I helped pave the way for so many female athletes in proving that actually you can be successful at both and you can become a gold medal winner and a mum at the very same time. Now, you're probably all thinking, what is a bike rider doing here? Well, you and me both. But I come from a world where a sporting world, that we're still fighting for equality. We have a minimum wage that is different to the men's, which I find absolutely bizarre. And that's the life that I've lived in for a very long time. So I'm hoping to share my experiences with you guys. So I didn't need 3 minutes, but I shall shut up for now.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And I suppose as we welcome Zelda to the stage, this is a living example of what Trevor was talking about. When one leader goes, what happens? How does that legacy continue? So you share your story.
I'm astounded.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again for having me on this panel this morning. I'm sure you all look at me and you think, well, the great liberator, Nelson Mandela, and she's white. Well, your question is very justified. I was born in apartheid South Africa in 1970 and lived by the rules of segregation and discrimination. Supporting apartheid and my privilege, and from a very young age we were indoctrinated to believe that we are the superior race as white Afrikaners in South Africa. minority rule, oppressing and discriminating against anyone with who look different and pray different and believe different than us. Then in 1994, with fate and circumstance, I ended up working for the person that my people believed is a terrorist and the enemy, Nelson Mandela, after he became the first democratic elected president of South Africa. My first encounter with Mr. Mandela was a life-changing moment for me, in which I realized that all these things that I've been taught over the years, believing that I'm superior, believing that I'm chosen, were wrong, and that we were indoctrinated, and due to heavy censorship, we were made to believe that we did not know about the level of discrimination in society and how we happily lived by that. Of course, meeting Nelson Mandela and then realizing that his philosophies about life, about democracy, equality, fairness and dignity for all human beings were things that I could subscribe to as well. We spoke earlier about the gap between what you do and what you say, and I'm proof and I'm a first-hand witness to the story of Nelson Mandela, that he lived by that every single day. It was not only something that he advocated for, diversity and inclusion, but it's also an arrangement he made in his most inner circle, me being in his office and being his private secretary. My story is one of change, of a metamorphosis, and believing that if I could change myself and challenge my bias and my prejudice, then everyone can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, and so John, would you like to join us? That's that will complete our panel. And a reminder that if you haven't put your questions in, or if you've got questions for anyone on the panel, or as this discussion evolves, then you can send them in via the link that you will have had as part of the invitation, and they will appear here on the screen for us. So thank you for the one or two that have already started to come in. Right, okay, well, this has been so inspiring. There's so much wisdom in this room. And as all of our speakers have been talking, we've heard some common themes around the transformations that they've made as individuals, but also tried to enact within their institutions. And fundamentally, you reminded me, Trevor, of my former bosses. That I'm going to have to use a word that's maybe a little bit on the expletive side. But this was shared with the whole organisation. I'm sure you probably may have heard of it yourself. But when Greg Dyke took over the reins and talked about the corporation being hideously white and made that push for the organisation to be more focused on diversity and inclusion, he told us all to cut the crap, right? Basically, just cut the crap, get on with it. So the difference between the say and the do gap. And I think that's where I'd like to start. And I'm going to start with you, John, because, you're in it here. What is the challenge here for you? What is the crap that we need to move forward in terms of leadership to get to the next place?
Wow. I mean, right. Have you got an hour? Because this could take a while.
Bullet points.
If you think about it, we've touched on bits and pieces. If you look at the world around us at the moment, we look around the world, 70 of the countries in which we operate will have gone through an election in the last 12 months. Over 50% of the world will have gone to the polls and probably changed their government. But, a statistic the like of which we've never seen. So Trevor mentioned AI and Gen AI. I mean, you look at the change that's going to come through a digital transformation. Digital transformation, I'm going to sound defensive now with the big digital transformation going on here, are difficult. They always struggle to get to goal. And then we've got the generational defining challenge for all of us, which is climate and all that's related to that. So there's an awful lot that's on the plate at the moment. And that cries in on leadership. It really cries in on leadership. The world, all of us, crave leadership, and we all feel gently let down, I think, when we look around. We want leaders, we want to believe in leaders, we want to follow leaders. And it's a big critical moment, I think, it sounds dramatic, for the world.
Absolutely. And so you're talking there about craving leadership. People do want somebody to point them in the right direction, give them the goals, where we need to go. Zelda, you started talking about Nelson Mandela quite clearly. We all know his famous story, but what do you think we can take from the way that he went from, you know, bringing all of those different perspectives, people, enemies together to create something that moved his nation forward? What can we as leaders learn from that?
I think what made Nelson Mandela such an authentic leader was that he had the ability to be relatable to everyone. The things that he did not only do on, on CEO level or on leadership level, but it was, the actions that he took, it was evident in everyday life. When he did something, it was always with a aim at diversity and inclusion. For instance, when we went on a state visit to Japan in 1995, President Mandela had this thing. He always wanted to introduce his entire delegation, from the most senior minister to the most junior person. Even the pilots of his aircraft were included. And when I looked at the delegation, I realized that we were completely representative of the population of South Africa. People could relate to that delegation there in Japan. And that is what made him such a revered leader, is everything he did was in that authentic way. It wasn't a choice. It became a very natural thing for him to do. And always seeking divergence. He had this thing of always seeking, people with different opinions, and even the enemies. He studied the Afrikaner because he knew that he had to negotiate with them. And he knew that the way, to get people around the table and to negotiate was to make sure that there's someone included in that delegation that represents every single opinion in the country. And that is what made him such a revered statesman.
So you've touched on this point of authenticity in leadership, but not everybody is going to be authentic in inclusion leadership. So Trevor, you've been talking about Green Park and the work you're doing with senior leaders there to support them in their aspirations. How do you support leaders or give advice to people here who may not feel comfortable in this space to lead authentically in this space?
Well, I think that our big thing that we do is tell our clients the truth. I think, we're fortunate that I think we can afford to say that we won't work with X because they aren't really serious about it. And I have to tell you, my chief executive, it took a little while for me to understand his MO. There was 4 or 5 years ago when we first went out and we'd be talking to people and maybe do a pitch. I remember we went to a very big professional services firm, big office near here, and we went in and we said, "Oh, we can do this for you, we can do that for you." And he didn't say anything for about half an hour. I'm a chairman. You're supposed to get on. Anyway, after half an hour, he said to the client, "You know what? I think we should end this meeting." And they said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, you obviously do not want to do what we want to do. There's not a lot of point us. If you don't want to change, we're never going to get on." And we left. I can tell you, I was absolutely, I wasn't quite ready for that. Actually, the morning after he called me, he said, "Okay, we've got a gig." Because sometimes people like you telling the truth. And if I may say so, Zelda, I really, what you said about Madiba absolutely resonated with me. And I want to just make a point about this issue of leadership. I think one of the truth that you need to tell leaders is it's not about you. It's not about you. Nobody really, I mean, it's good if you're nice and you're a good person and all that, but actually we don't really care. What we really care about is what you do. And one of the really telling things, I learned a lot from a very single moment that Mandela did, which is that the great leader identifies choice, because that's all that leadership is about. You know, you're not there to do stuff, you're there to make decisions, you're there to make choices. And you then have to find a way of signaling the choice you've made. And it's a choice that you expect everybody who works for you and with you to follow. That's what leadership is about. And the moment he picked up the Springbok jersey, that was a moment, it went around the world, but I guess to every South African, it said, we've made a choice. We're not going to be going in for retribution, and we're not going to pay this lot back or that lot back. Every South African's going to be part of this future, and everybody pay attention. I, Mandela, am telling you, that's where we're going. And if you don't want to do that, you're not on my side. That was leadership.
Mm.
Trevor, I think it's about choosing what's best for everyone as opposed to a leader that chooses only what's best for him or his select group. So I think that was the strength of the leadership that came through very clearly, was in that moment of wearing that jersey, it was, this is the choice for all of South Africa. You are either with us or you make a choice now. You are either with us or against us. And that brought the country together.
Mm. And Laura, it reminds me a little bit about sport. When you're making those team decisions, pushing people, to go the extra level, asking them to follow that goal and vision and whatever else, what can you share with us from your experiences that will be relevant to doing this in the business world, so we don't feel like we're sucking, everybody dry in that goal for our aspirations?
I mean, what I would say is I feel very privileged. I talked about London 2012 earlier, and I would say I feel hugely privileged that I got to work with Sir Dave Brailsford, who obviously created the whole London 2012. Well, they did it in Beijing, first of all, but then to carry it on for 4 years. And he had leadership like no one I've ever met in my life. We sat in a room like this. The very first time I met him was in 2010. And we sat in a room like this, right? And everyone was sat around tables, and he stood up at the front. And I was thinking, God, what am I part of here? Because I was so new to the system. And everyone was in there. We had mechanics, nutritionists, bike riders, you name it. Every single person who was going to be a part of that British cycling winning team going to London 2012 was sat in there. And now when we left, everyone believed that come London 2012, they were going to be winning the gold medal, stood on top of that podium. Because, like you say, it didn't matter. Dave B wasn't about himself. He was about the team. And ultimately, he stood there, and what he said to everyone, he didn't care whether people came at him and asked him questions or didn't agree with him. The only thing he cared about was everyone following. Mm. And as long as everyone followed, and as long as everyone was on that same page, we were going to be successful. And the way he managed to do that was like no one else I've come across within my career so far.
Mm. So there's somebody who's inspirational, they have the clear vision, and then they're holding everybody to account for delivering within that vision. And sometimes that's where we kind of fall down, because, in terms of the gap between the say and the do, we all say, we make the action plans, we have the meetings, and then nobody says, have you managed to do it? Now, back to you. In terms of, well, maybe it's a bit unfair, but in terms of, the goals, the vision, and accountability here, what are the, what's the key message you've got to all of your colleagues around that?
So I'm looking very nervously now, because Sora Gomez, who's my chief people officer, sat in the front row. She's thinking, God, what's he going to say? Mm. I get annoyed with this culture's a journey. It's not a journey. It's the same as everything else you do. It's an attitude. Mm. So, it's all about attitudes. And we talk about the inclusion and the diversity we want in business. Do we want it or do we not want it? If we do, it will happen, and it can happen quickly. Two quick stories on that. One of which is us. Diving's in its 10th year. As I said, 100 people to start with. Look at what's happened. There's a bit of time in that. I sort of said when Diving started, I turned up in Australia. No one prepared me for Australia. I thought, I'll be all right. They speak the same language. I forgot they didn't like me very much. I should have realised that climate change was alive and well. It was fairly obvious. So all the things I should have worked out. What I didn't know was that in 2011, federal government had mandated gender equality. Mandated gender equality. I thought, crikey, what does this mean? the nice thing was you go think, well, I'm running a financial services business. I mean, it can't be that hard. So I turned up and saw Andrew Mackenzie, who's running BHP Billiton. I think that's a little tricky. He's a miner. If I've told some of you this story, and he said, we've scratched our heads. So we got rid of job descriptions that don't work. We got rid of role profiles, doesn't work. So we've looked at characteristics and attributes that would attach to different roles. So we took a mine operator and we thought, right, they've got to be technologically savvy. They've got to have a right first time mentality. They've got to care. And he went down the list and he said, we went down the list and the best match was a nurse. And we thought, right, weren't expecting that. So they went into the health service, hired nurses, trained them as mine operators, productivity went up 8%. End of debate. And for me, end of discussion. So when you talk about diversity, you talk about inclusion, of course it makes a difference. Of course it's a value add in business. Sometimes you've got to push the button. We talk about it a lot. We set targets around gender and we set intentions around including sort of colleagues from ethnic minorities and ethnically diverse backgrounds. I think sometimes you have to set targets. I never like them. It doesn't feel right to me, but you've got to try and make the progress. But to me, fundamentally, it's attitude. Why should you not want to be as inclusive as much as you want to perform financially?
And if we don't hit the targets,
I think there's got to be a consequence. So for us, this is boring because this is insurance. So we have principles-based oversight. There are 13 principles. It's really boring. There are 4 gateway principles. One of them's culture. If you don't meet the gateway principle, you're not here. So you've just got to be really, really clear. You've got to be patient. You've got to nurture people. You've got to encourage them. But you've got to draw the line somewhere. And I think when you talk about people, talent, inclusion, which is ultimately defines all of us, you've got to draw a line.
Sometimes some people won't want to change. Maybe they can't change. Zelda, Nelson Mandela had to really quite quickly talk about his change and get people on board with his change. What can we take from how he approached that, bringing those people forward into this conversation in terms of leadership?
Well, I think he made it very personal. It's hard to believe, it's hard to believe how you could survive 27 years in prison, of which 18 years were spent in a cell. And when he reached out, he was a bit taller than me, but when he reached out like this, both his hands and his feet would touch the end of his cell. How do you spend 18 of the 27 years being locked up there from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 5 o'clock tomorrow morning? How do you survive that and remain hopeful in a situation like that? And, he said he realized in prison, I mean, obviously, there was a lot of meditation and so on involved, but he realized in prison that unless he changed himself first, he was not going to be able to change anyone around him. He said the hardest thing for him was to change himself. And I think, we can have forums and we can have talks and with, all these conferences, but unless we as people take that very serious and, have I sufficiently changed as a human being to embrace this diversity that I stand for? I don't believe that, we ever completely changed as human beings. I think we evolve as humans until the day we die. But always nudge in the right direction and trying to focus more on the self rather than trying to preach to people or convert them in any way, but leading by example. And I think that was what Nelson Mandela did.
Very true. When I'm called in by a CEO of the board to sort of analyse what's going on in the company, and then we look at where they are, one of the first questions I ask them is, where are you in this? And they've either, as a leader, been very passive in that they've, divested the responsibilities out to some people, not kept their eye on the ball, asked the questions, or they've been very active in the exclusions. So still bringing in their mates, having their kids around for the work experience, all the things that lead to the barriers. Laura, you touched on the fact that you're in a part of the sporting world that hasn't got gender equality right there, but yet you as an individual, you've figured out, you've been your success, and you're using your success to champion women's. Can you talk us through some of the kinds of things that you've done, so maybe we can learn from your sport, and you know, you're not there yet, but you're moving. So what's some of the sort of stuff that you've done there?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk about the good first, because that's always nice to celebrate, isn't it? Because actually, I would point out that I do think a lot of the time we talk about the negativity and, you know, the gaps that we need to fill, but we rarely celebrate the good. Now, what I would say is in 2016, I fell pregnant with my first son. And everyone thought, what on earth has she done? She's just ended her career. Now, I always thought I wanted to pause my career. I'd always had it in my head. I wanted to be a young mum. But at the time, UK sport didn't have a system in place that would help support mums coming back into the sporting world. So really, it was like British Cycling's job, I guess, to help create a system, which is now called the UK Sport Pregnancy Policy, to actually include females who are mothers to come back to a sporting world. And I would say that my journey, coming back through the system, there was very little I would have changed. I feel really honoured that British Cycling actually, I guess, followed my ideas. There was lots of things, you know, that we had to come together on to shape this pregnancy policy, but they were very open to getting me back into that team and including me. Because when you do step away from your career, you know, you can feel isolated at times. It's a difficult world to step back into. Someone replaces you instantly when you're out on maternity leave. And so the way they shaped it for me was team, you know, it was a team decision, and we did everything together. And actually, like I say, there's very little about my journey I wouldn't change. They allowed me to be a mum. They allowed my son to travel the world with me. He came everywhere. They included him in pretty much everything that I did. And so that side of things, honestly, I think was absolutely phenomenal. And the fact that they were so open and so accepting of my decision, because they didn't have to be. There wasn't a policy. They could have just said, no, sorry, Laura, there's the door. But they weren't. And so it was absolutely fantastic. The flip side of that, obviously in the cycling world, is the fact that road cycling just isn't equal in the slightest. And back in 2020, we celebrated the fact we got a minimum wage. It was the first time we'd ever had one, and it was 37,000 euros. And so you're like, finally. My sister is also a bike rider, not anymore actually, she's a coach, but she chose to go down the professional bike riding route on the road. And this was in 2009, she turned professional. And she rode for the first 4 years unpaid. My dad had to fund the whole thing. And then she finally got her first contract. And I remember we celebrated. She got 7,000 euros. Now, the men's equivalent was on the minimum wage of 42,000 euros. And so my sister eventually, I think after she retired in 2013, eventually just, it wasn't sustainable. You can't live off that. You're living off my dad's fund. And so she decided, you know, this isn't right for me. So in 2020, we celebrated the fact that we had this minimum wage, finally. But it's only the World Tour teams. Now, there's less World Tour teams for the women than there is the men. And everyone else underneath the World Tour team who actually does the same, they travel the world, they do the same bike races, they don't have a minimum wage. A quarter of the females peloton don't get paid to ride their bikes. And to me, it's mad that we can physically live in a world that the minimum wage is still different. Like, how is that normality?
And it's great that you're using your platform to try and accelerate this. But Trevor, all of your experience with the work you're doing around Green Park, what are the key drivers that leaders can do to shift the dial? Because
can you go sit in
stuck.
the UCI?
So I'm still kind of astounded that it's got to be legal. I mean, it's got to be unlawful, hasn't it? I mean, I can't. Okay, let's talk offline. A courtroom beckons. Look, I think actually I would quite like to hear something from Laura, because I think big part of my answer to the question you just asked me, Elonka, is this. One of the things I think that leaders have got to get their heads around in relation to diversity and inclusion, I'm going back to my Sunday morning versus Monday morning thinking. On Sunday morning, you don't really have to have an active theory of change, because on Sunday morning you're saying to people, be conscious, be aware, be a better person. And that's all about you. And nothing wrong with that. But on Monday morning, you've got to drive the machine. And the machine doesn't drive itself in some magical way. You actually have to, if you're driving a car, it's got to have petrol, it's got to have gears, it's got to have a carburetor, or whatever the EV equivalent is. There's got to be a theory of change. And one of the things I was really struck with, and I don't know much about it, I've read about it, but I really believe in it, the Brailsford idea that what you do is you change a small thing or 100 small things, and that adds up, aggregates up, it's a real theory of change. You can actually apply it, and everybody can understand it, and they can get on with it. And I think one of the things we need to be thinking about in diversity and inclusion is, what is our theory of change? Historically, it's been tell everybody to be nice. Well, great. But the truth of the matter is, everybody in this room knows that's not enough. So what are the levers that we need to pull? Is it reward? Is it money? Is it status? Is it structure? I think we need to start thinking pretty hard about what is our new theory of change in this world that I tried to describe earlier on. And I think to give you a concrete answer, I'm very taken by what John said about the BHP Billiton thing, because that's my territory. I started life as a petroleum engineer, and I generally believe data, numbers, insight, get structure, you get an answer, and then you try the answer. And some may or may not work, but you've got a good chance. So I think, for example, the whole idea that you analyze and you understand in numbers what's going on is really, really important, which brings me simply to the point. I think the big thing that we in the DEI territory have to start thinking about harder is, do we have enough data? Do we have the right sort of data? Are we collecting the right sort of data? And by the way, representation is not enough. I want to know about how people behave, actually, in different circumstances. I think that you can see, for example, to take a contemporary example without going too legal, I bet I could find 2 or 3 indicators that would have told me what was happening in Harrods without even knowing who's owning it.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing those insights. Already we've got quite a lot of people wanting to ask questions, so I'm going to throw some of those questions open to anybody in the room, or I can ask some of the ones on here. But let's see, the people who've come all the way and joined us, if you want to put your hand up if you've got questions to any of the panel or all of the panel. Any questions from this space? There's a couple here, and there's a microphone coming to you. So I think we've got this, that lady there.
Hi, good morning. Thank you to all the panellists. My name's Barry. I have a reproductive healthcare startup in insurance. Really excited, John, for the work that Lloyds are doing with, is it Future at Lloyds? I thought you might want to tell us a little bit more about that and what your aspirations are for that, particularly around inclusivity. Yeah,
it's inclusive futures, and it's, one of the disadvantages of being in situ for 300 or so years is that we've generally offended most people at some point in our history, and with no pride. And when you think of the debate around the Atlantic slave trade, that the right thing for us to do was to understand, to apologise, but to think forwards. What can we do now, and what should we do going forwards? So around inclusive futures, it was about looking at black colleagues from ethnic minority backgrounds, and thinking, how do we take those colleagues right the way from the journey, which goes from school to the boardroom, including Green Park, I hasten to add. So that's what we've done, and there are 8 companies that are participating in that from the start. I hope we create some FOMO, and that what we want to do is show how we can take literally thousands on that journey. And we set an ambition very early on to say, look, if you look at colleagues from ethnic backgrounds, they should represent 1 in 3 hiring. Today, it's almost 1 in 4. So we're not there, but we're getting there. And I think Inclusive Futures will be a real bellwether of how to take people right the way through their career, not just a point in time, right the way through their career. So really excited about it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. And I'm sure the Dive In team will be able to send you further information if you wanted to find out about that. Another question coming from here, and you can address it to anyone in our panel.
So good morning, panel. I'm Vivian Cameron. I work at the Chartered Insurance Institute. Any of the panel can answer this, but what would you suggest is going to be the key to sustainability? It's phenomenal. We do this festival every year. I'm very proud to be part of it and work with a great team of colleagues and associates with the same vision. But it'd be interesting to hear what's going to make it sustainable for the future.
Well, I'll give one brief answer.
Thank you.
The boss of every company, John can contradict me if he wants, one of the things that motivates them most is being the best in class, and for everybody to see that they're best in class. So I'm a great believer in data and transparency, because I've not yet met a company chairman who is not wanting to show he or she is better than, or his or her company better than all the rest, and even more, is terrified that they're not as good as the others. So, big thing for me, data, transparency, competition.
Thank you. We've got a question coming in from one of our colleagues living in Greece, and this is about how leaders can influence not just their own organisations but also government. So this question: I'm living and working in Greece where people with disabilities are very poorly represented. How can leaders of big organisations influence even governments to rectify this underrepresentation? So what is the role of the leadership in big organisations to help influence social and political change, which will benefit our businesses ultimately if we're including everybody? Anyone have any thought? That's a big question, but
yeah, I think what's quite neat at the moment, and I think it is changing for me, is that I think businesses and governments have realised that there needs to be a coming together. So I think of some of the issues that we try and deal with, whether it's issues around inclusion/talent or whether it's climate. We need government, regulators, insurers, and sometimes banks in the same room. And there is a realisation of that. And you do see that change. So certainly for our part, we feel included in those conversations. And the intention is there. I mean, to Trevor's point, what we've got to do is be very clear in terms of what are the outcomes and what's going to be different.
Brilliant. Anybody else in the room before there's a couple of hands going up there. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. We talked a lot about leadership and the leaders driving the change, but what happens if you don't have maybe a leadership on board? Like, what would you recommend to people within the organisation about what they could do?
I mean, I guess I'll start with what the Lionesses did, right? So the FIFA, for example, obviously it isn't equal within football either. The Lionesses have carried on talking and have carried on shouting about it. And I think having a group of people underneath a leader who all have the same mentality, all have the same focus and drive to change something is bigger than one person with a ruling that you don't agree with. And so I think if there's something that you don't necessarily, that you believe wants to change, but you've got someone at the top saying, no, that's not happening, you are better together. You are better all coming out and all speaking up and keep shouting and keep speaking about it until someone listens. Because ultimately, that one person will eventually have to change. If you can prove that everyone else believes in something else, then that one person is a minority.
So the speaking up, really important. Thank you. And then a quick question from, I think it's there, if that's right.
Hi, thank you. I'm Tasneem, and thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I actually work a lot with leaders on emerging talent, and I often see a big difference between where leaders are in terms of diversity and inclusion and where emerging talent is in terms of, especially if you're talking about Generation Z and Alpha, they're an activist type population. They really care about diversity and inclusion, not just from a kind of events and so on, but actually policies and frameworks in place. What advice would you give to leaders on how to appeal to the emerging talent that's coming up so that they don't lose out on the upcoming generations?
Yeah, because quite often what we do is we bring people in for all of that difference and the added value, and then we sort of train them in our ways, and then they become just the same. So what's the advice?
Elonka, if I may, I think also with something that Trevor said earlier, you've got the data. What do you do with the data? Do you listen to the data? Do you listen to understand the data? That's one of the strengths, I think, of Nelson Mandela's great leadership, was that he had the ability to listen, to understand, rather than to respond. So, this could be a one-way street where leaders tell people how to behave, but are we really listening and interpreting the data that we receive to change behavior? So I think for me, consistency in that is quite important.